I inherited 1,500 acres from my grandfather. A woman named Debbie decided it belonged to her instead. She forged a signature and rigged a fake auction. I lost everything while working 2,000 miles away. 3 years later, I came home to strangers living on my land. But Debbie made one fatal mistake. She kept receipts. The county clerk who helped her turned out to be her own cousin. What happened next tore down far more than just her buildings. My name is Ethan Cole. 1,500 acres of Texas grassland my grandfather Walter carved out of nothing. Cattle by cattle. Fence post by fence post. Until it became the kind of land people slowed their trucks down just to look at from the county road. When Grandpa Walter passed, the ranch went into a family trust, with me and my Aunt Carol as co-trustees. I was 31, working an engineering contract overseas, trusting the paperwork, trusting the neighbors, trusting a system I hadn't yet learned could be quietly rigged against me from 4,000 miles away. 2 years before Grandpa died, the county redrew its boundary lines, and Cole Ranch got swallowed into something called Meadow Creek Ranch Estates, a homeowners association none of us asked to join, run by a woman named Debbie Ashcroft who introduced herself at the annexation meeting like she already owned the place. Debbie had a gift for sounding helpful while taking control. She volunteered for every committee, memorized every bylaw loophole, and within 18 months she was HOA president, treasurer, and architectural review chair all at once. A one-woman government nobody had the energy to challenge. My grandfather never trusted her. He used to say some people join a club just to find out where the doors lock. He paid his dues on time, kept his fences neat, and avoided her meetings whenever he could, which only seemed to annoy her more. After he died, the dues notices started arriving addressed to the Cole estate, vague and inconsistent, sometimes late, sometimes never at all. I set up autopay from overseas and assumed the matter was handled. I had no idea Debbie was the one deciding whether those payments ever got recorded. My Aunt Carol lived in Ohio, elderly, trusting, and completely unfamiliar with rural Texas land law. Debbie found her fast. She called Carol directly, introduced herself as the neighborhood liaison, and began building a relationship my aunt had no reason to question. Debbie's real talent wasn't paperwork. It was patience. She spent 2 years positioning herself as the reasonable, caring HOA president while quietly documenting a manufactured case that the Cole estate was delinquent, unresponsive, and abandoning its obligations. I called Carol every few months to check on the property. She always said the same thing. Debbie says everything's fine. Don't worry about a thing. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Up like a friendly neighbor doing us a favor. What I didn't know was that Debbie's son, Tyler, worked at a small title company 2 counties over. He processed land documents for a living, and he understood exactly which forms nobody double-checked, and exactly which government office was easiest to slip something past. Tyler's specialty was quitclaim deeds, quiet, fast, and rarely scrutinized if the notarization looked clean. His mother didn't need to threaten anyone or break a window. She just needed one signature that looked convincing enough to survive a glance. The HOA covenant technically allowed liens for unpaid dues, and after enough unpaid liens, a foreclosure sale. Debbie had studied that clause for months. All she needed was a paper trail showing the coal estate as delinquent long enough to justify seizing the land through the association's own courts. Started small, the way these things always do. A dues notice arrived claiming I owed 4 years of back payments despite my autopay records. I forwarded my bank statements immediately, certain it was a clerical mix-up that would resolve itself within a week. Instead of a correction, I got silence. Then a second notice, this one threatening a compliance lien for an unregistered outbuilding on the property. Grandpa's old hay barn, standing exactly where it had stood for 40 years, suddenly labeled a violation. I called the HOA office directly. Debbie answered herself, warm as ever, assuring me it was just a formality, and that she'd personally make sure it got sorted. Her voice was so calm I nearly forgot to be worried. That calm, I'd later learn, was the whole strategy. Weeks passed with no resolution. My Aunt Carol mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd signed a little form Debbie brought by the house, something about confirming trustee information for HOA records. Carol hadn't read it closely. She trusted the nice woman who always sent Christmas cards. I asked Carol to mail me a copy of whatever she'd signed. She said she'd get to it. When I finally saw a scanned copy, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a records confirmation. It was a limited power of attorney over association-related property matters. I didn't know yet how far that document would be stretched. On paper it looked narrow, harmless, bureaucratic. In Debbie's hands, it became the legal key she needed to start moving pieces without either trustee's real knowledge or consent. By spring, the lien notices had multiplied: unpaid dues, unauthorized agricultural use, an old irrigation ditch reclassified as a drainage violation. Each one alone seemed almost laughably petty. Together, they were building a paper case that made Coal Ranch look neglected, non-compliant, and ripe for seizure. I hired a local attorney, Marcus Webb, mostly out of frustration, expecting him to send one firm letter and end the nonsense. Instead, he called me back within 2 days, his voice tighter than I expected. "Ethan," he said, "I need you to look at your county property records right now." My hands were shaking before I even opened the file. The Meadow Creek HOA had recorded a foreclosure notice against Coal Ranch 2 months earlier, citing the limited power of attorney Carol had unknowingly signed as authorization for the association to act on the trust's behalf. The notice claimed proper mailed warnings had gone to both trustees. I never received a single one. Carol never received one either. Later we'd learn the mailed notices were sent to a P.O. box Debbie herself had opened, one she quietly listed as the trust's official address. I flew home the following week, using vacation days I hadn't touched in 2 years, telling myself this was surely a mistake big enough that a phone call and a signature could undo it. I had no idea I was already 3 moves behind in a game I didn't know I was playing. The drive up the county road toward Coal Ranch should have felt like coming home. Instead, I saw a new gravel entrance cut straight through Grandpa's south pasture, flanked by a hand-painted sign reading Ashcroft Meadows, Private Event Grounds. My chest went cold before I even reached the gate. A crew was already grading land near the creek. Heavy equipment tearing up grass that had never known anything but cattle hooves. I got out of my truck, heart pounding, and asked the nearest worker who had hired them. He shrugged and said, "Mrs. Ashcroft, now." I laughed, actually laughed. The kind of laugh that comes out when your brain refuses to process what your eyes are showing you. She doesn't own this, I said. He just pointed toward a stack of paperwork clipped to his truck visor. County stamped. Official looking. Undeniable. I drove straight to the county recorder's office and requested every document filed against Cole Ranch in the last year. The clerk who helped me, a young woman new to the job, pulled up a chain of title that made my stomach turn over completely. The trust's title had transferred to an entity called Ashcroft Land Holdings LLC, sold at what the paperwork called a properly noticed association foreclosure auction. Purchase price listed at $12,000 for 1,500 acres of prime Texas ranchland worth well over $11 million. $12,000. Certain it had to be a typo. It wasn't. Threshold. The HOA covenant allowed for a distressed compliance sale, a number Debbie clearly knew by heart because she'd written the covenant clause herself 2 years earlier. I asked the clerk who had recorded the transfer. She checked the notary stamp and the processing initials, then looked up at me with an expression I'll never forget. That one was processed by Pam Ruiz, she said. She's actually related to the buyer, I think. Small county. Pam Ruiz, a deputy clerk with just enough authority to stamp documents through without a second set of eyes checking her work, and apparently just enough family loyalty to never ask why a 1,500-acre ranch sold for the price of a used pickup truck. I called Marcus that night, and for the first time since this began, I heard real anger in his voice instead of caution. This isn't a paperwork mistake, Ethan, he said. This is fraud, dressed up in enough legal language to survive a casual glance. We're going to need everything. Marcus laid out the uphill climb plainly. Fighting an HOA foreclosure after the fact meant proving the sale itself was invalid, improper notice, forged authorization, or procedural fraud, and doing it against a woman who apparently controlled the very office meant to catch her. I spent that first week just documenting. Photographs of the new gravel road slicing through Grandpa's pasture. Photos of surveyor's stakes near the creek where Debbie's crew was clearly planning something bigger than an event lawn. Every image felt like evidence of a wound still bleeding. Carol called me in tears once she understood what her signature had actually done. She kept apologizing, over and over, blaming herself for trusting a woman who'd brought her banana bread on 3 separate holidays. I told her the fault wasn't hers. The fault belonged to someone who'd built an entire strategy around exploiting exactly that kind of trust. Marcus requested the HOA's official notice records under Texas Open Records provisions covering association governance. Debbie's office took 6 weeks to respond, then produced only a single certified mail receipt, for one notice, to an address none of us had ever lived at or authorized. I drove past the old hay barn and found it already half demolished, its lumber stacked for reuse. Grandpa built that barn with his own father in 1974. Watching pieces of it hauled away for someone else's construction project felt less like property loss and more like grief. Debbie, meanwhile, was posting on the neighborhood Facebook group about her exciting new community events venue, complete with drone footage of the land, my land, captioned with 3 champagne emojis and the words, "Dreams really do come true when you work hard for them." I didn't comment. Warned that anything public could complicate the case later. So I sat there, scrolling through strangers congratulating a woman for building a wedding venue on my grandfather's cattle pasture. And I said absolutely nothing. Cost me more restraint than I knew I had. A neighbor named Ruth, who'd known my family for decades, messaged me privately. "Something's not right about how fast this happened," she wrote. "Debbie tried something similar with the Alvarez place 2 years back. Might be worth asking around." That single message would change everything. I found Hector Alvarez's number through Ruth and called him that same night. He was hesitant at first, guarded, until I explained what was happening to my family's ranch. Then his voice changed entirely. 40 acres, he said quietly. She took 40 acres from us the exact same way. Hector's story matched mine almost line for line. Mysterious compliance liens, a limited power of attorney his elderly mother hadn't understood, a rock-bottom auction price, and a buyer entity with Debbie's fingerprints all over it, though he'd never been able to prove it in court. Hector still had his old case file, boxed up in his garage, untouched since his lawyer told him the fight wasn't winnable with the evidence he had. He offered to hand it over without hesitation. "Somebody should finally stop her," he said. "I just didn't have the money to be that somebody." Marcus spent an entire weekend cross-referencing Hector's old paperwork against mine. The pattern wasn't subtle once you saw it laid side by side. Same notice language, same $12,000 sale price, same buyer entity name with only the county changed. This wasn't one mistake. It was a method. I started keeping a private folder titled simply Pattern, filling it with screenshots, scanned filings, and time-stamped notes. Every entry felt less like paranoia and more like proof that Debbie Ashcroft had built an entire quiet business model out of confusing, isolating, and outlasting people who trusted her. Debbie's construction crew moved fast. Within a month, a metal-roofed pavilion rose near the creek, tall enough to see from the county road, complete with string lights and a gravel dance floor. She was marketing weddings on land whose legal ownership was actively being contested in county records. I drove out one evening just to see it up close, foolishly thinking distance might make it hurt less. Didn't. Edge of my own grandfather's creek. Watching a stranger's construction crew hammer decorative fence posts into cattle-grazed earth felt like watching someone rearrange furniture in your childhood bedroom without asking. A worker recognized me from my first visit and quietly warned me to be careful. "Mrs. is everywhere around here," he said, glancing toward the site trailer. "Zoning office, county commissioners, half the church board. People don't cross her twice." I thanked him and drove home unsettled. Marcus filed our first formal challenge that week, a petition to void the foreclosure sale on grounds of improper notice and fraudulent authorization. It felt like the smallest possible action against the size of what had been taken, but Marcus reminded me every case starts with one filed page. The HOA's attorney responded within days, dismissively, calling our claims an emotional family dispute unrelated to valid association governance. Reading that line, I understood for the first time just how confident Debbie was. She wasn't scared of us. She genuinely believed she was untouchable. Carol mailed me a manila envelope of every document Debbie had ever brought to her house. Birthday cards, a fruit basket note, and buried at the bottom, an early draft of the limited power of attorney with handwritten margin notes in Debbie's handwriting explaining, line by line, how to phrase it convincingly. Those margin notes were the first piece of paper that felt like real proof of intent, not just sloppy process. Someone confused doesn't draft persuasive talking points in the margin of a legal document months in advance. Someone planning something does exactly that. Marcus warned me the road ahead would be slow, expensive, and emotionally brutal, fighting not just Debbie but an entire small-town infrastructure of familiarity that had quietly protected her for years. I told him I didn't care how long it took. I wasn't walking away from 1,500 acres without a fight. I took an extended leave from my overseas contract, something my company wasn't thrilled about, but I couldn't run a fraud case from 4,000 miles away. I moved into a rented cabin 15 minutes from Cole Ranch, close enough to watch, document, and refuse to disappear. Debbie noticed my return almost immediately. Small-town news travels fast, and within a week I received a certified letter from her HOA attorney warning me against harassing association contractors or trespassing near active event grounds that sat, legally disputed, on land she didn't actually own. I laughed reading that letter, though there was nothing funny about it. She was threatening trespassing charges against me for standing near my own grandfather's creek. Marcus filed a formal response reminding her attorney that ownership was precisely the matter currently under legal challenge, and premature threats wouldn't help her case. At the next open HOA meeting, I showed up uninvited, sitting quietly in the back row while Debbie ran through routine agenda items with practice charm. When public comment opened, I stood and simply asked one question. Can you explain the $12,000 sale price for 1,500 acres? The room went dead silent. Debbie's smile didn't waver, not even slightly, but her eyes did, just for half a second, flicking toward her son Tyler in the third row before she recovered and said smoothly, "That's a legal matter currently under review, not appropriate for open discussion tonight." A board member named Linda Byers, quiet the entire meeting, caught my eye afterward in the parking lot. She glanced around before speaking, voice low. "I've had questions about some of these liens for a while," she said. "I just never had proof strong enough to say anything out loud." Linda and I met privately 2 days later at a diner outside town, far enough from Meadow Creek that nobody would recognize us together. She admitted she'd started quietly recording board meetings on her phone months earlier, uneasy about decisions she couldn't fully explain but wasn't yet brave enough to challenge. She handed me a small flash drive across the table like it was something dangerous. "I don't know if this helps," she said, "but there's a meeting on here where Debbie talks about the Cole property before any lien was even filed. Like she already knew it was happening." I listened to that recording alone that night in my rented cabin, headphones in, hands cold. Debbie's voice, casual and confident, discussing the Cole parcel opportunity, a full 6 weeks before the first compliance notice was ever sent. She hadn't reacted to a violation. She'd planned one. Marcus said the recording alone wasn't enough to win in court. But combined with Hector's matching case and Carol's forged authorization, we finally had something resembling a real pattern of premeditated fraud instead of an isolated misunderstanding easily explained away by a good lawyer. Debbie's construction, meanwhile, kept expanding. Guest cabins went up along the tree line, a second gravel road cut toward the north pasture, and a professionally printed brochure began circulating online advertising Ashcroft Meadows. Weddings, retreats, and corporate events on 1,500 sprawling acres. Seeing my grandfather's cattle land rebranded as a luxury event venue, complete with a logo, felt almost surreal, like watching your own biography rewritten by someone who'd never met you. Every new building was another public, Physical bet that she'd never actually be caught. I started documenting the construction methodically, photographing each new structure with timestamps, cross-referencing them against county permit records. What I found stunned even Marcus. None of it, not the pavilion, not the cabins, not the graded roads, had a single approved county building permit. Debbie had been so confident in her paper ownership that she'd skipped permitting entirely, assuming her control over local processes would smooth over any inspection later. It was reckless in a way that told me something important. She genuinely believed nobody would ever check. Marcus filed a parallel complaint with the county building and zoning department, separate from the ownership fraud case, documenting unpermitted commercial construction on disputed land. A quiet zoning inspector named Rosa Delgado picked up the file and, unlike everyone else so far, actually returned my calls. Rosa drove out to the site herself, clipboard in hand, and walked the grounds while Debbie's crew watched nervously from a distance. She confirmed what I already knew: commercial-grade electrical work, a septic system, and an event pavilion, all built without a single inspection or permit on file. This alone could halt construction, Rosa told me afterward, regardless of who eventually wins the ownership dispute. For the first time since this began, I felt something shift. Debbie had built her empire so fast and so confidently that she'd left it standing on legal quicksand. Debbie apparently heard about the zoning complaint fast. Within 2 days, my rented cabin's landlord received an anonymous call questioning my background and intentions, clearly meant to make him nervous enough to end my lease early. He didn't budge, but the message was clear: she was pushing back. I sat in Marcus's office that week, watching him lay Hector's file, Carol's forged authorization, Linda's recording, and Rosa's zoning report side by side across his desk like puzzle pieces finally forming a picture. "This isn't just winnable anymore," he said.
"This is starting to look..."
For a few weeks, everything went strangely quiet. No new construction announcements, no aggressive letters, no Facebook posts about upcoming weddings. I should have found the silence reassuring. Instead, it made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain, like the pause before a held breath finally releases. Marcus said it wasn't unusual. Opposing counsel sometimes goes quiet while regrouping strategy, especially once real evidence starts stacking up against a confident client. I used the lull to gather more of my own history, digging through old family photo albums for proof of decades of Cole family land use. I found a photo from 1988 of my grandfather branding cattle in the exact spot where Debbie's pavilion now stood, time-stamped on the back in his own handwriting. Small as it seemed, Marcus said photographs like that could matter enormously in establishing decades of continuous, undisputed ownership before any of this began. Carol flew down from Ohio for the first time since the funeral, wanting to see the land herself and give a formal statement to Marcus about exactly how Debbie had approached her, what was said, and how deliberately reassuring every single interaction had felt at the time. Watching my aunt stand at the edge of the property, staring at cabins built on land she'd unknowingly helped sign away, was one of the hardest moments of the entire ordeal. She wasn't careless, and the distinction mattered more to me than I expected it to. During that quiet stretch, I also reconnected with old ranch hands who'd worked for my grandfather years earlier, gathering sworn statements about the properties. Continuous agricultural use. Statements that would later help dismantle Debbie's claim that the land had been neglected and non-compliant before her intervention. Rosa, the zoning inspector, called with an update. The county had officially issued a stop work order on all Ashcroft Meadows construction pending resolution of both the ownership dispute and the permit violations. It was the first real, enforceable consequence Debbie had faced since this began. Debbie's response to the stop work order wasn't panic. It was public defiance. She posted online that bureaucratic red tape was temporarily delaying operations, framing herself as a hardworking small businesswoman fighting government overreach, somehow spinning her own unpermitted construction into a sympathetic underdog narrative. People believed her. Most. Comments poured in supporting poor Debbie, painting me, a man simply trying to reclaim his family's stolen land, as some outside troublemaker trying to ruin a beloved community leader's dream. The lull wasn't peace. It was her regrouping the narrative. Linda warned me privately that Debbie had started quietly asking other board members whether Linda had been talking to outsiders. The recording's existence apparently hadn't leaked yet, but suspicion was rising. Linda said she was scared, but she also said she wasn't backing down. That mattered more than I could tell her. The quiet ended the moment Debbie's attorney filed a motion trying to have our ownership challenge dismissed entirely, arguing the trust's own bylaws barred outside legal action against duly authorized association decisions. It was aggressive, fast, and clearly meant to end the fight before real discovery could begin. Marcus wasn't rattled. If anything, he seemed almost energized. "They're scared of discovery," he told me. "Nobody files to dismiss this hard, this early, unless they're worried about exactly what we might find once we're allowed to actually dig through their internal records." The judge denied the motion to dismiss, ruling that fraud allegations involving a power of attorney deserved full examination regardless of association bylaws. It was a small procedural victory, but Marcus called it the first real crack in Debbie's confidence. She'd expected an easy exit. She didn't get one. Debbie escalated fast after that ruling. She began publicly implying, at HOA meetings and online, that I was unstable, vindictive, and still grieving in an unhealthy way over my grandfather's death, a narrative designed less to win in court and more to poison me in the eyes of every neighbor I'd known for years. It worked on some people. A few old family friends started avoiding eye contact at the feed store. One even asked me outright if it was true I'd threatened Debbie's construction crew, a story that had apparently spread through the community with zero basis in anything I'd actually done. I stayed quiet publicly, on Marcus's advice, but privately it was exhausting watching a woman rewrite my own character in real time to a community that had known my family for 3 generations, simply because she needed a villain to distract from the fraud she'd actually committed. Debbie's next move was sharper. She had her attorney send Carol a letter suggesting that if the lawsuit continued, Carol herself could face co-liability exposure for allegedly authorizing a fraudulent trust transaction. A legal bluff meant purely to frighten an elderly woman into pressuring me to drop the case. Carol called me in tears, terrified she might somehow go to jail for something she never intended, something Debbie had engineered entirely. I spent an hour on the phone reassuring her, then called Marcus, furious. He confirmed instantly it was an empty scare tactic with zero legal merit, and fired back a sharp response. That letter, meant to intimidate, ended up backfiring completely. Marcus flagged it to the judge as evidence of witness intimidation against an elderly co-trustee, a move that visibly irritated the court and quietly damaged Debbie's credibility months before we'd even reach a real hearing. Around this time, Linda's recording finally became known within the HOA board, apparently through a leak neither of us caused. Debbie moved fast to have Linda removed from the board entirely, citing vague conduct violations, a transparent retaliation that only made Linda more determined to testify against her. With Linda formally off the board and free from any lingering loyalty obligations, she agreed to give a full sworn deposition. Marcus prepared her carefully, walking through every recorded meeting, every internal email, every moment Debbie had discussed the coal property before any official violation had even been filed. Linda's deposition ran nearly 4 hours. She described watching Debbie casually mention opportunities involving distressed properties months before liens were filed, describing it, in Debbie's own words, as getting ahead of the paperwork. It was damning, delivered calmly, and devastating for the other side's narrative of innocent mistake. Meanwhile, Hector Alvarez, emboldened by our progress, decided to formally reopen his own case, filing alongside ours under a pattern of fraud argument Marcus had been quietly building for weeks. 2 victims together carried far more legal weight than one man's isolated, easily dismissed complaint against a respected community leader. Debbie's attorney tried one more aggressive tactic, offering me a private settlement, a modest cash payment in exchange for dropping the case entirely and letting Ashcroft Meadows continue operating uncontested. The number was almost insulting, a fraction of the land's true worth, clearly meant to make the whole problem disappear quietly. I refused without hesitation. This was never really about money to me. It was about 1,500 acres my grandfather built with his hands, and about a pattern of fraud that had already hurt Hector's family once and would keep hurting others if nobody ever stood firm enough to stop it. Debbie's confidence started visibly cracking after that refusal. Neighbors reported she'd grown short-tempered at meetings, snapping at contractors over minor delays, pushing construction crews to finish visible portions of the venue faster, almost as if she sensed the walls closing in and wanted to lock in appearances before they fully did. Rosa, the zoning inspector, returned for a follow-up visit and found active construction continuing quietly despite the stop-work order. Workers cutting corners under cover of early morning hours. She issued a formal violation citation directly to Ashcroft Land Holdings LLC, adding real financial penalties to Debbie's mounting legal exposure. Marcus subpoenaed Pam Ruiz's clerk office records, requesting every document she'd personally processed involving Ashcroft Land Holdings across the past 3 years. The county attorney's office, apparently uneasy about the request, quietly opened its own internal review into her handling of association-related filings. That internal review terrified Debbie in a way nothing else had. Pam was family, yes, but she was also a potential liability now facing her own scrutiny. And family loyalty tends to crack fast once real professional consequences start looming over someone's actual career and freedom. I received an unexpected call one evening from Pam Ruiz herself, her voice shaking, asking to meet privately. Marcus advised extreme caution, insisting any conversation happen through proper legal channels only, refusing to let anything said informally jeopardize the case we'd spent months carefully building. We arranged a formal, recorded meeting at Marcus's office instead, with Pam's own attorney present to protect her interests. She arrived pale and clearly exhausted, admitting almost immediately that Debbie had pressured her repeatedly to process filings quickly without the usual verification steps, framing it always as just helping family. Pam claimed she hadn't known the full scope of what she was enabling, insisting she believed the documents were legitimate, simply expedited as a favor. Marcus didn't fully buy the innocence, but her cooperation, offered in exchange for leniency, handed us internal HOA correspondence we'd never have accessed otherwise. Those internal emails were the single biggest break in the entire case. Debbie had written to Tyler months before any lien was filed, discussing the Cole property by name, referencing its market potential, and instructing him on exactly how to structure the eventual quitclaim paperwork to survive scrutiny. Reading Tyler's own name attached to fraud planning, not just his mother's, changed everything about the case's scope. This wasn't one manipulative woman acting alone in a moment of greed. It was a coordinated family operation, built methodically, refined across multiple victims, executed with real legal knowledge behind it. Marcus immediately expanded the lawsuit to formally include Tyler Ashcroft as a co-defendant, alongside Ashcroft Land Holdings LLC itself, arguing conspiracy to commit fraud rather than simple procedural negligence. The stakes for Debbie's family had just risen from embarrassing to genuinely, personally dangerous. Debbie's husband Frank, largely absent from the public conflict until now, was named in a discovery request regarding the LLC's finances, since he'd co-signed several of its loan documents. Neighbors began noticing Frank's truck missing from their driveway for days at a stretch, an early crack nobody could yet explain. Rumors started circulating that Frank hadn't known the full details of what the business actually involved, believing it was a legitimate event venue investment rather than land seized through forged authorization. Whether true or convenient timing, he quietly hired his own separate attorney within the week. Debbie, sensing her control slipping in multiple directions at once, doubled down publicly instead of retreating. She scheduled a grand opening weekend for Ashcroft Meadows, defying the standing stop work order entirely, apparently betting that enough paying guests and positive publicity could outrun the mounting legal pressure closing in. Rosa's office responded immediately, issuing a cease and desist specifically barring any commercial event hosting on the property until zoning violations were resolved. Debbie ignored it, on confidence and control, and backing down publicly now would have shattered the image she'd spent years constructing. I stood at the edge of my own land that week, watching catering trucks roll past the very Ashcroft Meadows sign built over my grandfather's pasture gate, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit anymore. It was about watching someone gamble everything rather than admit fault. The grand opening weekend arrived anyway. String lights glowing over the pavilion. A wedding party posing for photos beside cabins built without a single permit on land whose true ownership was still legally contested in an active courtroom. Debbie stood at the entrance greeting guests like nothing was wrong at all. Rosa's office, coordinating with county officials, arrived mid-event with a formal enforcement notice. Though out of caution for the guests present, they allowed the ceremony to conclude rather than create a public scene. It was a quiet warning shot, not yet the full reckoning, but a clear signal the walls were closing in. Debbie framed even that visit publicly as harassment, posting photos of the smiling wedding couple online with a caption thanking guests for supporting small business despite unnecessary interference. Watching her spin an active fraud investigation into a heartwarming underdog story took a kind of shamelessness I hadn't fully grasped until then. Behind the scenes, though, cracks kept widening. Frank moved out of the house that same week, And within days, a friend of Linda's confirmed he'd filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences in paperwork that, according to courthouse gossip, conspicuously avoided mentioning any specific reason at all. Tyler's employer at the title company, alerted by the expanding lawsuit naming him directly, placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review of every document he'd personally notarized over the past several years. His entire professional foundation was quietly crumbling under the weight of his mother's ambitions. Marcus filed for expedited discovery given the mounting evidence of ongoing violations. And the judge, clearly losing patience with Ashcroft Meadows' continued operation despite repeated citations, granted it. Depositions were scheduled for Debbie, Tyler, and Pam Ruiz within the month, a timeline that visibly rattled the other side's confidence. Debbie's second wedding booking that month was abruptly canceled by the couple themselves after local news picked up a small story about ongoing zoning violations at a Meadow Creek area event venue.
Word was spreading beyond the neighborhood now, and her carefully built public image was starting to genuinely fracture.
I received an anonymous letter at my rented cabin, and signed, warning me to let this go before people get hurt. Marcus insisted on reporting it directly to the sheriff's office, refusing to let intimidation tactics escalate unaddressed. It rattled me, honestly, more than I wanted to admit to anyone. The sheriff's office took the threat seriously enough to add a note to the active fraud file, and a deputy drove past Cole Ranch periodically over the following weeks. Whether or not Debbie was directly responsible for the letter, the timing made it hard to believe it was pure coincidence. Hector called me that week, voice steady in a way it hadn't been during our first conversation months earlier. "You're doing what I couldn't finish," he said. "Whatever happens now, you've already proven I wasn't crazy. She really did do this before." That call meant more to me than he probably realized. Debbie's depositions began in early autumn, held in a small conference room at Marcus's office building, with her own attorney visibly tense beside her. She arrived composed, dressed sharply, smiling at everyone as though this were simply another community meeting she fully intended to control. That composure lasted almost exactly 40 minutes. When Marcus introduced the recording of her discussing the Cole parcel opportunity weeks before any lien existed, her smile faltered for the first time in this entire ordeal, replaced briefly by something rawer, something closer to genuine panic quickly swallowed back down. She claimed the recording was taken out of context, a phrase she repeated so many times over the following hour that even her own attorney visibly winced each time it left her mouth. Context, turned out, was not something a premeditated timeline of fraud could easily explain away. Tyler's deposition, 2 days later, was worse for the family's case. Younger, less composed under pressure, he admitted almost immediately to drafting the quitclaim language his mother requested, insisting repeatedly he'd believed it was legitimate, though the emails Marcus produced told a starkly different, far more calculated story. Pam Ruiz's deposition, given under her cooperation agreement, filled in the final procedural gaps, confirming she'd processed the Cole Ranch transfer without standard notarization verification, specifically at Debbie's personal request, understanding at the time it was, in her words, not exactly by the book. With 3 depositions complete, Marcus felt confident enough to file for summary judgment on the core fraud claim, arguing the combined evidence left no Reasonable dispute that the foreclosure sale had been built on forged authorization and a deliberately manipulated paper trail from the very beginning. Debbie's attorney fought hard against summary judgment, requesting a full trial instead, likely hoping a jury might respond more sympathetically to her carefully cultivated community reputation than a judge weighing raw documentary evidence. The court agreed to set a trial date, but denied her request to keep operating the venue meanwhile. The judge issued a preliminary injunction, formally barring any further events, construction, or public use of the disputed land until the case concluded. For the first time since this nightmare began, Ashcroft Meadows sat completely, legally silent, its string lights dark, this gravel lot empty of visitors. Debbie posted nothing online for nearly 2 weeks after that injunction, the longest silence from her since this entire saga began. Neighbors started noticing, whispering, wondering aloud what exactly had happened to the confident woman who'd spent 2 years insisting everything about this land was perfectly, legally hers. I drove past the silent pavilion one evening, engine idling at the edge of the road, and felt something unexpected settle over me. Not triumph yet. The first quiet this land had known since strangers first cut a gravel road through my grandfather's pasture 2 years earlier. Trial was set for late winter, giving Marcus nearly 4 months to prepare a case that would need to convince a jury, not just a judge, that Debbie Ashcroft had knowingly, deliberately stolen 1,500 acres through forged authorization and a captured, complicit county process. We spent those months building exhibits, Carol's original unmarked power of attorney beside Tyler's edited version, Linda's recording transcript, Hector's matching case file, Pam's admission, and county zoning citations documenting unpermitted construction on land whose ownership was actively disputed the entire time. Debbie's legal team, meanwhile, shifted strategy entirely, now arguing that even if procedural errors occurred, the eventual construction and community value of Ashcroft Meadows should factor into any resolution, essentially asking the court to reward her investment despite how the land had actually been obtained. Marcus called that argument, privately, one of the most audacious things he'd encountered in years of practice, asking a court to essentially bless the fruits of fraud simply because the fraud had been executed with enough confidence and enough concrete poured before anyone managed to stop it. Rose's zoning department formally condemned 2 of the guest cabins during this period, citing structural code violations from rushed, unpermitted construction, adding yet another layer of documented harm entirely separate from the ownership fraud itself. Stacking evidence Debbie's attorneys increasingly struggled to spin favorably. Frank's divorce finalized quietly that winter, and courthouse records, now public, revealed he'd received a substantial settlement specifically excluding any interest in Ashcroft Land Holdings LLC, his attorney apparently having insisted on fully separating him from an entity already tangled in active federal-adjacent fraud allegations. Word around the county was that Frank had cooperated informally with investigators, providing financial records showing Debbie had personally directed every major decision involving the LLC's formation and funding, further undercutting any claim that this had been some kind of shared, good-faith family business venture. Debbie's remaining allies on the HOA board grew visibly thinner as trial approached, several quietly resigning rather than risk being pulled into depositions of their own. The woman who'd once controlled every committee in Meadow Creek now found herself increasingly, conspicuously alone at meetings she still technically chaired. I received a call from a local news reporter researching a story on HOA fraud patterns statewide, having found Hector's and my cases connected through public court filings. Marcus advised caution about what I shared, but agreed limited. Factual comments might actually help counter Debbie's lingering public narrative. The resulting article, careful and fact-based, quietly reshaped public opinion across the county. Comments under Debbie's old "dream come true" post shifted overnight from congratulations to confused, then angry questions. The community that once cheered her on was finally starting to ask the right questions. Months too late for some, but not too late for me. As trial neared, Debbie's attorney requested one final settlement conference, offering this time to return the land outright in exchange for dropping all criminal referrals and civil damages beyond simple restitution. It was a meaningfully bigger offer than before, a clear sign her legal team saw real trouble ahead. Marcus and I discussed it carefully. Getting the land back mattered enormously, but so did accountability, and so did Hector, whose 40 acres remained gone unless our combined pattern case succeeded fully at trial rather than settling quietly behind closed doors that protected Debbie from any lasting consequence. I told Marcus to reject the offer. This had never been only about getting my own land back. It was about a woman who'd done this before, who would likely do it again to someone else's grandmother or aunt, unless the courtroom made unmistakably clear that this pattern would finally end here. Debbie's attorney seemed genuinely surprised by the rejection, apparently having assumed money and land alone could resolve everything quietly, the way it likely had with previous quieter, less organized victims who'd lacked the resources or evidence to fight back as thoroughly as Hector and I now finally could together. Jury selection began on a cold February morning. The courtroom packed tighter than I expected for what technically remained a civil fraud case. Word had clearly spread through the county. People wanted to see, firsthand, whether the woman who'd run Meadow Creek like her personal kingdom would finally answer for it. Debbie arrived each day dressed impeccably, composed, greeting familiar faces in the gallery with practiced warmth, still performing the role of wronged community leader even as Marcus methodically laid out, exhibit by exhibit, a timeline that left decreasingly little room for any innocent interpretation of her actions. Carol flew down again to testify in person, her voice shaking slightly on the stand but never wavering in substance, describing exactly how Debbie had approached her, what was said, and how deliberately reassuring every visit had felt until the moment she finally understood what she'd actually signed. Linda testified next, calm and precise, walking the jury through the recording, describing board meetings where Debbie discussed opportunities with a casualness that made clear this wasn't panic or confusion. It was routine. Linda's own careful words on the stand, simply how Debbie operated. Hector's testimony landed hardest of all. A quiet, dignified man describing losing 40 acres his own father had cleared by hand, describing how powerless and unheard he'd felt fighting alone 2 years earlier, and how differently things might have gone if anyone had listened to him back then. Rosa testified about the unpermitted construction, methodical and unemotional, laying out code violation after code violation with the kind of dry technical authority that somehow landed harder than any impassioned speech could have, simply because it was so plainly, unquestionably, undeniably documented in official county records. Pam Ruiz testified under her cooperation agreement, visibly uncomfortable but honest, confirming exactly how she'd processed the fraudulent transfer at Debbie's personal request without standard verification. Watching a family member testify against her in open court seemed to hit Debbie harder than anything else so far. Tyler testified reluctantly, his earlier composure entirely gone, admitting under Marcus's careful, patient cross-examination that he'd known the quitclaim deeds. Authorization was questionable at best, but had processed it anyway because, in his own words, "My mom said it would be fine, and she's usually right about this stuff." That single sentence, "she's usually right about this stuff," seemed to land on the jury with real weight, revealing something the entire trial had been circling around from the start. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern trusted so completely by her own family that nobody had ever thought to question it. Debbie herself finally took the stand near the trial's end. Still composed on the surface but visibly rattled beneath it, her explanations growing, increasingly circular under Marcus's methodical cross-examination, each answer contradicting some earlier document already entered into evidence days before. When Marcus asked her directly why the sale price had been set at exactly $12,000, the covenant's stated minimum threshold, she hesitated for the first time in the entire trial, finally answering that she believed the association deserved compensation for years of neglect. The jury's faces made clear they weren't buying it. Closing arguments stretched across an entire afternoon. Marcus laid the whole timeline out one final time. Methodical and unhurried, the forged authorization, the captured clerk's office, the unpermitted construction, the matching pattern with Hector, the recording proving premeditation weeks before any violation officially existed. Debbie's attorney argued passionately that his client had simply been an ambitious community leader who'd made procedural errors amid genuine confusion, insisting the jury shouldn't punish hard work and vision just because paperwork had been handled imperfectly along the way. Felt, even to me, like a losing argument delivered well. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. I spent that entire stretch pacing the courthouse hallway with Marcus, Carol, and Hector, none of us saying much, all of us simply waiting for 2 years of stolen land and stolen trust to finally reach some kind of formal, undeniable conclusion. When the jury filed back in, I couldn't read their faces at all, and for one terrifying moment I genuinely believed we might lose despite everything we'd built. Then the foreperson stood, and the verdict came, clear and unanimous: fraud, on every single count against Debbie and Tyler Ashcroft both. The courtroom didn't erupt exactly, but I heard a collective exhale ripple through the gallery. 2 years of quiet community suspicion finally validated in a single, official word. Debbie sat frozen at the defense table, the composure she'd worn like armor for 2 straight years finally, completely gone. The court immediately voided the entire fraudulent foreclosure sale, restoring full legal ownership of Cole Ranch to the family trust, with Carol and me as rightful trustees once again, exactly as my grandfather had originally intended before a stranger decided his land was hers to take. Hector's 40 acres were restored as well. The judge ruling the pattern evidence conclusively proved both seizures shared the same fraudulent method, executed by the same people, through the same captured county process, entitling him finally to the land his father had cleared by hand decades earlier. But ownership was only half the remaining problem. Ashcroft Meadows still stood physically on my land, the pavilion, the cabins, the graded roads, every structure built without a single valid permit. on property Debbie Ashcroft had never actually legally owned for even one single day. Marcus explained my options clearly. As lawful owner, I could pursue removal through the county's unpermitted structure enforcement process, or file for a court order compelling Debbie personally to demolish and remove everything at her own expense, since none of it had ever been legally authorized to exist. I chose both, without hesitation. Rose's zoning department, already holding a stack of outstanding violations, moved quickly once true ownership was legally confirmed, issuing a formal removal order for every unpermitted structure on the property within 30 days, at the responsible party's expense, not mine. Debbie's attorney requested an extension, hoping to salvage at least the pavilion for eventual resale value elsewhere. The judge denied it flatly, noting the structures had been built in direct, repeated defiance of a standing stop work order, on land the defendant had already been criminally referred for illegally seizing. Yes, criminally referred. Alongside the civil verdict, the district attorney's office, watching the trial closely, opened a formal criminal investigation into fraud, forgery, and official misconduct, naming Debbie, Tyler, and Pam Ruiz all as subjects, a consequence far heavier than money alone could ever have delivered. Pam, given her cooperation, ultimately faced reduced charges and a plea agreement including permanent removal from any county clerical position. Tyler's title company terminated him outright once criminal charges were formally filed, ending a career built partly on the same shortcuts that had helped his mother steal land twice. Debbie faced the heaviest exposure by far, multiple felony counts of fraud and forgery. Given the scale, the premeditation, and the confirmed pattern spanning two separate victims, her attorney began quietly discussing plea negotiations almost immediately once the criminal charges were formally filed against her. I stood at the property line the morning demolition crews arrived, watching heavy equipment tear down the very pavilion where Debbie had hosted her defiant grand opening months earlier. It wasn't cruelty I felt watching it fall. It was something closer to a long, slow exhale finally released. The demolition took 11 days total, clearing the pavilion, the guest cabins, the unauthorized gravel roads, and the drainage system Debbie had installed near the creek without a single permit ever filed for any of it. Piece by piece, my grandfather's pasture began, slowly, to look like itself again. I salvaged what lumber I could from the old hay barn's remains, still stacked where Debbie's crew had left it 2 years earlier, and started rebuilding it in the exact same spot, using the same footprint, wanting at least one small piece of this land to feel restored rather than simply cleared. Ruth, the neighbor who'd first pointed me toward Hector, stopped by one afternoon while I worked on the barn frame, bringing coffee and an apology for staying quiet as long as she had. "We should have believed you sooner," she said. I told her most people believe what's easiest until they can't anymore. The Meadow Creek HOA itself didn't survive the fallout intact. With Debbie criminally charged and multiple board members having resigned mid-scandal, the remaining homeowners voted to dissolve the association entirely and reorganize under new, far more transparent leadership with mandatory third-party audits of every future compliance decision. Linda, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to chair the new interim board, insisting on bylaws specifically requiring independent verification for any lien, foreclosure, or property authorization going forward, a direct, deliberate response to exactly the kind of quiet, Unchecked power Debbie had spent years carefully accumulating for herself. Debbie ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a full criminal trial, pleading guilty to multiple felony fraud and forgery counts in exchange for a reduced but still substantial prison sentence, full restitution to both Hector and me, and a lifetime ban from serving on any homeowners association board again. Standing in the courtroom for her sentencing, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I mostly just felt tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who'd spent 2 years fighting to reclaim something that should never have been taken in the first place. Relieved more than victorious as the judge read her sentence aloud. Tyler received a lighter sentence given his age and his cooperation once charged, though his professional license was permanently revoked, ending any future career in title work or real estate law. Whatever role his mother's confidence had played in pulling him into this, the consequences were now entirely, unavoidably his own. Frank, fully separated from the fallout by then, reportedly moved to a small house 2 towns over, rebuilding quietly, rarely mentioned in local conversation anymore except as a footnote to the larger story of what his ex-wife had ultimately built and lost in her relentless hunger for control. Hector used part of his restitution to finally clear his father's 40 acres of overgrowth, planting the same crop rotation his father once ran there, calling me the week he harvested his first full season back on the land. "Feels like getting a piece of him back too," he said quietly. "I spent that first spring after demolition simply walking the land. Slow, unhurried laps around pastures that hadn't felt entirely mine in years. Even before Debbie. Even during the quiet months when I was overseas trusting a system that had nearly let a stranger steal my entire inheritance without a fight." Carol visited again that summer, this time not for depositions or testimony, just to see the rebuilt hay barn standing where the original always had, in the exact spot her father raised it decades earlier. She cried a little, standing there, and told me Grandpa would have been proud of how hard I fought. I finally brought cattle back onto the land that fall. A small starter herd, nothing close to what my grandfather once ran, but enough to hear hooves on grass again instead of construction equipment. Enough to feel like Cole Ranch was slowly, deliberately becoming a working ranch once more. The county's zoning department, with Rose's continued oversight, added Cole Ranch's fraud case to internal training materials for new clerks, using it as a cautionary example of exactly how quietly, patiently, and dangerously institutional trust can be exploited by someone determined enough and clever enough to study every loophole first. Linda's reorganized HOA board later awarded Hector and me both a small, almost symbolic community recognition for exposing a pattern that likely would have continued victimizing others indefinitely. I didn't need the plaque, and back, and the quiet, and my grandfather's grass under cattle again. Ruth mentioned once that some longtime residents still occasionally defended Debbie privately, insisting she'd just gotten in over her head, rather than deliberately planned 2 separate frauds years apart. I've learned some people will always find a gentler story to tell about someone who was kind to them personally. I don't think about Debbie often anymore, though the empty gravel lot where her pavilion once stood still catches my eye occasionally when I drive that stretch of the property, slowly growing back over with native grass. Nature reclaiming ground far faster than I expected it ever would. Marcus and I still talk occasionally, mostly about ranch matters now rather than legal ones, though he jokes sometimes that Cole Ranch v. Ashcroft made him a small kind of local legend among attorneys handling rural HOA disputes across 3 surrounding counties in the years since our trial concluded. Hector and I stayed close, meeting up occasionally to compare notes on cattle prices and irrigation repairs. 2 men who'd never have crossed paths at all if a woman named Debbie hadn't decided both our family's land was quietly, patiently hers for the taking. I think about my grandfather often while working this land now, wondering what he'd say watching his grandson spend 2 years in courtrooms and county offices simply to keep what he'd built by hand. I like to think he'd understand completely. Some things are always worth fighting all the way through. The rebuilt hay barn finished just before winter. Weathered lumber salvaged from the original standing alongside new boards. A visible seam between old and new that I decided, in the end, to leave exactly as it was rather than sand away. A quiet reminder of everything this land had survived. I hung my grandfather's original branding iron above the barn door, the same one visible in that 1988 photograph that had mattered so much during discovery. A small deliberate gesture connecting 3 generations of Cole family hands working this exact same ground through very different kinds of hardship. Local news ran a brief follow-up story that winter on Cole Ranch's restoration, framing it less as a legal victory and more as a quiet portrait of land finally returned to its rightful, working purpose after 2 years tangled in fraud, forgery, and one woman's relentless hunger for control over everything around her. Debbie's sentencing included a provision requiring quarterly restitution payments, a slow, grinding financial consequence that Marcus said mattered almost as much, symbolically as the prison time itself, ensuring she couldn't simply serve her sentence and walk away financially untouched by 2 years of premeditated theft. I heard through Ruth that Debbie's remaining friendships in the county had largely dissolved entirely, that she'd become, in the space of one trial, exactly the kind of cautionary local story she'd once so skillfully spun other people into being for her own benefit and reputation. There's a strange kind of justice in that specific reversal. I think, watching someone who built her entire identity around controlling other people's narratives lose control of her own so completely and so publicly, in the same small community she'd spent years carefully, quietly maneuvering to dominate. Linda's reorganized HOA board eventually invited me to speak at an open meeting about the fraud process. Not as a victim exactly, but as a resource for other homeowners learning to recognize similar warning signs before they escalate as far as mine and Hector's cases ultimately had. Standing at that podium, in the same meeting room where Debbie once ran every agenda with practiced, quiet control, felt like a strange kind of closure I hadn't expected to need, but very much did. Watching neighbors take careful notes on exactly the kind of manipulation that once fooled every one of us. I still keep that folder labeled pattern somewhere in a filing cabinet. Evidence long since submitted and used. Verdict long since delivered. But I've never quite been able to throw it away. Feels, even now, like proof that patience and documentation eventually beat confidence and control every single time. Cole Ranch runs quietly again these days. Cattle grazing where a wedding pavilion once stood. Native grass slowly reclaiming gravel roads that were never legally supposed to exist there in the first place. My grandfather's land, finally, fully, undeniably mine again. Exactly the way it always should have stayed. Some nights I still drive out to the creek at sunset. The same spot where I once stood watching strangers hammer decorative fence posts into my family's pasture. And I sit there quietly, listening to water moving over stone the way it has for longer than any of us have been alive. I think that's ultimately what land teaches you. If you let it, that people can lie, forge, manipulate, and scheme for years. But the ground itself just keeps being what it always was underneath everything. Patient and steady, waiting for the right hands to finally return and tend it properly again. Hector visited last spring with his own grandkids, walking them across Cole Ranch's south pasture, telling them the whole story from start to finish, careful to explain that sometimes doing the right thing takes years, takes documentation, takes refusing to quietly disappear when someone with more power tells you that you should. I've started keeping my own records more carefully now. Not out of fear exactly, just out of hard-earned habit. Every dues payment, every piece of correspondence, every small interaction documented and dated, because I learned the hard way that trust alone was never quite enough protection against someone determined to exploit it. Marcus told me recently that 3 other rural counties nearby have since tightened their HOA foreclosure verification requirements, citing our case specifically during hearings. Small ripples of actual policy change spreading outward from what started as one woman's stolen 1,500 acres of Texas grassland. I don't know if Debbie ever thinks about any of that from wherever she's serving her sentence now. Whether she understands the actual scope of what her ambition ultimately cost. Not just my land and Hector's, but her marriage, her son's career, her cousin's job, her entire community standing, all of it gone. I understand now that people like her rarely see it that way anyway. Rarely count the true cost of what they've broken. Too busy explaining, even to themselves, exactly why it was reasonable. Exactly why the rules simply didn't apply the same way to someone as capable and deserving as they believe themselves to be. Carol calls every month now. Not out of worry anymore. Just habit. Just family. Asking about the cattle. Asking about the barn. Asking whether the grass near the creek has fully grown back yet. It has. But it finally, completely has. I planted a small stand of oak trees near where the old hay barn stands. Saplings that won't offer real shade for another decade at least. A deliberate, patient bet on this land's future the same way my grandfather once made decades ago when he first started building something meant to outlast him. Some mornings, walking the fence line at sunrise, cattle grazing quietly around me exactly the way they should. I forget entirely that any of this ever happened. Then I pass the empty gravel patch by the creek. Grass slowly winning its way back through the stone. And I remember completely. I've come to believe that people like Debbie count on exactly that kind of forgetting. On victims too exhausted, too isolated, or too disbelieved to ever fully document, connect, and expose a pattern spanning years and multiple families. Hector and I simply refused to let that particular bet pay off for her. Ruth still brings coffee out to the ranch some mornings, and we talk less about Debbie now and more about ordinary things. Cattle prices, whether the oaks near the barn will need extra water this summer. It's a small, ordinary kind of peace I genuinely didn't expect to feel again this fully. I drove past the old Alvarez property last fall. 40 acres green and full again under Hector's careful management, and felt something settle firmly into place. 2 separate thefts. 2 separate families. 1 connected fight. And finally, 2 pieces of stolen land both fully, legally, permanently restored to where they always belonged. My grandfather used to say the land always remembers who actually worked it. no matter what any piece of paper claims otherwise. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I stood in a demolished pavilion's footprint watching native grass reclaim ground faster than any fraudulent deed ever could hold onto it. Cole Ranch's cattle herd has grown steadily since that first small group I brought back 3 years ago. Close now to what my grandfather once ran here himself. A slow, deliberate rebuilding that feels less like recovery and more like simple, patient continuation of exactly what this land was always meant to be. I still have Linda's original flash drive, evidence long since duplicated and submitted years ago, but I keep it anyway, tucked in the same drawer as my grandfather's old branding records. 2 very different kinds of proof that this land, and the people who fought to protect it, were always worth defending fully. Debbie's name comes up occasionally still, mostly in passing, mostly from newer residents who've heard some fragmented version of the story secondhand and want to know if it's really true that a whole 1,500 acres nearly disappeared into one woman's forged paperwork before anyone finally managed to stop her completely. I tell them it's true, all of it, and that the only reason it didn't work was patience, documentation, and one honest board member finally brave enough to hand over a recording that changed absolutely everything. Most people go quiet after that, genuinely surprised something so brazen could nearly succeed for so long. Hector and I talk sometimes about writing the whole story down properly someday. Not for money or attention, just so other families facing something similar somewhere else might recognize the pattern faster than either of us managed to the first time it quietly, patiently started happening to us both. For now, though, I mostly just work the land. Cattle grazing where a stranger's wedding venue once stood. Oak saplings slowly growing near a rebuilt barn. Grass steadily winning back every inch of gravel that never should have been laid there in the first place. Exactly as my grandfather always intended it to stay. Winter came again. Quiet and ordinary. Cattle huddled near the tree line. Frost settling over pasture that finally, fully belonged to no one but the Cole family. Exactly the way it always should have from the very beginning. Long before anyone ever tried to forge that fact away on paper. I stood at the property gate one cold morning, looking out over 1,500 acres my grandfather built from nothing, that a stranger nearly stole through forged signatures and captured paperwork, that I fought 2 full years in courtrooms and county offices to finally, completely, legally reclaim as fully, undeniably mine again. Somewhere behind bars now, Debbie Ashcroft is serving the sentence her own ambition ultimately earned her. Stripped of every board seat, every ounce of community standing, every piece of land she never actually owned in the first place. Left finally with nothing but the consequences of exactly what she chose to do. Tyler is rebuilding some smaller, quieter version of a career elsewhere now. Far from title work. Far from any position of trust involving other people's property records. The direct professional cost of choosing loyalty to his mother's ambition over basic honesty when it mattered most for both of them. Pam finished her reduced sentence and moved out of the county entirely. No longer working in any clerical position anywhere. The quiet family favor that started this whole scheme ultimately costing her the very career she'd used to help her cousin steal 1,500 acres in the first place. Frank rebuilt a modest, quiet life 2 towns over. Largely forgotten now except as a footnote in a story far bigger than his own role in it. A man who simply signed loan documents for a business he apparently never fully understood the true, fraudulent nature of until it was already too late. Hector's 40 acres run steadily now under his careful management. Green and full exactly the way his father once kept them. A second family's stolen land finally. Fully restored alongside my own. Proof that patience, documentation, and refusing to stay quiet eventually does add up to something real. Linda still chairs Meadow Creek's reorganized board. And under her leadership, no lien, foreclosure, or property authorization moves forward now without independent, mandatory verification. A direct, deliberate safeguard built specifically from exactly the kind of quiet, unchecked power one woman once carefully, patiently accumulated entirely for herself. Rose's zoning office still cites Cole Ranch occasionally in training materials for new inspectors. A cautionary tale about exactly how much unpermitted construction can quietly accumulate when nobody bothers checking. And exactly how fast enforcement can finally catch up once somebody actually does. Carol still calls every month. Asking about cattle. Asking about the barn. Asking whether the grass has fully grown back near the creek. It has. Completely. The way it always eventually does once the right hands finally return to tend the ground properly again after everything that tried to take it away. I think often about that first day I drove up the county road and saw a gravel entrance cut through my grandfather's south pasture. Certain then it had to be some kind of mistake a single phone call could easily undo. It wasn't a mistake. It was the opening move of a 2-year fight. I think, too, about every small piece of evidence that eventually stacked into something undeniable. A margin note in Debbie's own handwriting. A recording Linda almost didn't have the courage to hand over. A matching case Hector had nearly given up pursuing years before I ever called him that first night. None of it, alone, would have been enough. Together, patiently assembled over 2 exhausting years, it became a fraud case so thorough that even a jury sympathetic to a well-liked community leader ultimately had no real room left to doubt exactly what had actually, deliberately happened here. I learned something during those 2 years I didn't fully expect to learn. That fighting fraud isn't usually one dramatic confrontation, but hundreds of small, unglamorous moments of documentation, patience, and refusing to quietly disappear when someone with more apparent power insists, again and again, that you should. Debbie counted on exactly that kind of quiet disappearing. The same way she apparently had with Hector years earlier, before either of us knew the other existed, before a shared community whisper network finally, quietly connected 2 separate victims into one undeniable, matching pattern of fraud spanning years. I think that's the real ending here. More than any courtroom verdict or demolished pavilion. 2 strangers, robbed the same careful way by the same confident woman, finally finding each other, comparing notes, and discovering that together they were simply too much evidence for any fraud, however patiently built, to survive. Cole Ranch stands quiet now. Cattle grazing under an autumn sky. A rebuilt barn holding my grandfather's old branding iron above its door. Oak saplings slowly growing near ground that once held a stranger's stolen wedding venue. Every trace of what Debbie built here finally, completely, legally gone. I walk this land most evenings now. The same fence lines my grandfather walked. The same creek bank. The same wide Texas sky stretching out over 1,500 acres that very nearly disappeared forever into one woman's forged signature and one captured county clerk's careless, complicit stamp. It didn't disappear. Fully, legally, completely mine. Exactly the way it always should have stayed from the moment my grandfather first raised that hay barn decades ago. Long before anyone ever tried to convince a small Texas county that 1,500 acres could quietly, fraudulently belong to someone else instead. I still keep that pattern folder in my filing cabinet. Evidence long since used. Verdict long since delivered. Land long since restored. But I keep it anyway. A small, permanent reminder that patience and documentation, given enough time, eventually beat confidence and control every single time they're truly tested against each other. Marcus still checks in occasionally, mostly just to see how the herd is doing now, though he mentions sometimes that our case gets cited in law school. Seminars discussing rural HOA fraud. A strange kind of legacy for 2 years that felt, while living through them, like nothing but exhausting loss after loss. Rosa retired last year, and at her small retirement gathering, several colleagues mentioned Cole Ranch specifically as one of the cases that convinced the county to finally overhaul its permitting oversight entirely, closing exactly the kind of quiet gaps Debbie had once so confidently, so patiently exploited for years. Linda's reorganized board recently celebrated 3 full years without a single contested lien or foreclosure dispute. Quiet, unremarkable statistic that nonetheless represents exactly the kind of boring, trustworthy governance that should have existed here all along, long before one ambitious woman ever decided otherwise for her own benefit. Hector's grandchildren now help him work the same 40 acres his own father once cleared by hand. 3 full generations finally, fully connected to land that nearly disappeared forever into someone else's forged paperwork and captured county process before 2 strangers found each other and refused to quietly stay separate. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Ruth had never sent that first message about the Alvarez case. If Hector and I had simply remained 2 isolated victims, each convinced individually that fighting a well-connected, well-liked community leader alone was simply too exhausting, too expensive, too unlikely to ever fully succeed. I think Debbie counted on exactly that isolation. The same quiet, patient strategy that apparently worked for years before 2 victims finally accidentally connected through one small, almost offhand neighborly message that changed absolutely everything about how this entire fraud case would ultimately, completely unfold from that point forward. Cole Ranch's cattle herd crossed 200 head last spring. Still smaller than what my grandfather once ran here, but growing steadily, deliberately, the same patient, working rhythm this land has always known underneath every single thing that tried, and ultimately failed, to permanently take it away from my family. I planted a second small stand of oaks last fall, near the creek this time, exactly where Debbie's pavilion once stood, deliberately reclaiming that specific ground, with something that will genuinely outlast every single structure she ever illegally built here without a single valid permit or a shred of actual legal ownership. My grandfather always said real land can't be truly stolen, only borrowed briefly by someone confident enough to forge the paperwork and patient enough to wait for nobody to check closely. I understand that completely now, standing here, watching cattle graze quietly over ground finally, fully restored to exactly where it belongs. 1,500 acres. Restored. 40 more beside it. Restored. 1 fraudulent HOA. Dissolved and rebuilt honestly. 1 woman's carefully built empire of forged paperwork and quiet manipulation. Completely, permanently, publicly dismantled, piece by documented piece, over 2 long years that finally, fully ended exactly the way they always should have. The county clerk's office now requires 2 independent signatures for any HOA-related property transfer. A small procedural change with Cole Ranch's case number attached quietly. In the training footnotes, proof that sometimes the most lasting victory isn't the verdict itself, but the exact door it permanently, quietly closes for someone else's future. I still get occasional letters from strangers in other counties. People who read about the case somewhere and recognized uncomfortably similar warning signs in their own HOA dealings, asking careful, hesitant questions about documentation, about patience, about exactly how long a fight like this genuinely, honestly takes to finally see through. I answer every single one the same honest way, slowly, exhaustingly, but completely winnable if you document everything. Trust your instincts the moment something feels quietly, persistently off, and never assume one confident, well-liked person automatically controls the outcome simply because they've controlled every room they've ever confidently walked into before. Hector and I finally wrote our story down properly last winter. Not for money, exactly as we'd once talked about, just a plain, careful account meant for anyone else. Quietly facing something similar, sitting alone right now wondering if fighting back against someone powerful and well-liked is truly, genuinely worth the exhausting cost. It is. Completely now. Standing on land that very nearly disappeared forever. Watching cattle graze exactly where they always should have. Exactly where my grandfather first raised them decades before any of this ever began. Long before one ambitious woman ever decided this ground was quietly, fraudulently hers instead. Cole Ranch doesn't feel like a battlefield anymore. Hasn't for a long while now. Just quiet, working land again. Fences mended, cattle grazing, oak saplings slowly growing near a rebuilt barn that still carries the exact same footprint my great-grandfather first chose for generations before any of this ever happened here. I think about my grandfather often while working this ground now, wondering what he'd genuinely say watching his grandson spend 2 full years in courtrooms and county offices simply to keep exactly what he built here by hand. I believe completely he'd understand. Some things are always fully worth fighting all the way through. Debbie Ashcroft remains, as far as I know, still serving her sentence, stripped completely of every board seat, every acre, every ounce of the careful community standing. She spent years quietly building for herself, left finally with absolutely nothing but the full, permanent, undeniable consequences of exactly what she chose to do. I've made peace with never fully understanding why she chose this particular path. Why forging one elderly woman's signature felt reasonable enough to risk everything over. Twice. With 2 entirely separate families. Some people, I've learned, simply convince themselves the rules were never quite meant to apply to someone as capable as they believe themselves to be. 1,500 acres of Texas grassland stand quiet under a wide autumn sky tonight. Cattle settling in near the tree line. A rebuilt barn holding my grandfather's. Old branding iron above its door. Every trace of what one woman illegally built here now completely, legally, permanently gone from this ground forever. I stood at the exact spot where Debbie's pavilion once glowed with string lights during her defiant grand opening. Now nothing but native grass and 2 young oak trees slowly, patiently reclaiming ground that never should have held anything but cattle and creek water in the first place. The demolition crew's final invoice, addressed to Debbie personally per the court order, sits framed in Marcus's office now. A strange trophy of sorts. Proof that the person who illegally built an entire event venue on stolen land ultimately paid, in full, for its complete legal removal down to the last gravel truck. I think that detail matters more than people initially realize. She didn't just lose the land. She personally funded the exact undoing of everything she'd illegally built on top of it. Every dollar of demolition traced directly back to the same confident ambition that started this entire 2-year fight in the first place. Carol visited again this past spring, walking the rebuilt barn slowly, running her hand along the seam between salvaged and new lumber, telling me quietly that her father would have appreciated exactly that detail most of all. Nothing wasted, nothing erased, just honestly rebuilt from whatever survived the fight intact. Hector's 40 acres and my 1,500 now sit connected by an easement we arranged together last year. A simple gravel path linking two properties that fraud once tried to separately, quietly steal, now instead permanently, deliberately joined by the exact friendship that ultimately helped expose the whole scheme in the first place. I drive that connecting easement most weekends now, checking fence lines on both properties. Cattle grazing calmly on either side. Two families' land finally, fully secure again. Protected now by documentation, by connection, by simply refusing to ever again assume that quiet, confident authority automatically deserves unquestioned trust. The oak saplings near the creek have grown taller than I expected already. Real shade finally starting to fall across ground that once held nothing but a stranger's illegal wedding venue. A slow, deliberate, living reminder that patient, honest work always eventually outlasts whatever confident fraud tries briefly to build on top of it. I still think, sometimes, about that very first HOA notice claiming 4 years of unpaid dues despite my clear autopay records. How easily I nearly dismissed it as simple clerical error. How close that small, quiet lie came to becoming the opening page of a story that nearly ended very differently for my family. It didn't end that way, though. It ended here. Cattle grazing under a wide Texas sky. 1,500 acres fully, legally, permanently restored. A rebuilt barn standing exactly where it always should have. And one confident, manipulative woman finally, completely stripped of every single thing she'd quietly, patiently tried to steal. My grandfather used to say land remembers who actually worked it, no matter what paper claims otherwise. Standing here now, watching cattle graze over ground that survived 2 years of forged signatures and quiet institutional betrayal, I finally, fully understand exactly what he meant by that all along. Word eventually reached me that Debbie's remaining relatives, distant cousins mostly, had quietly renamed their own family gatherings to avoid mentioning her at all. An entire branch of family history now carefully edited around the 2 years she spent building and losing an empire made of forged signatures and stolen land. I don't take satisfaction in that particular detail, honestly, though I understand why some people might. Mostly I just feel a kind of tired relief that the whole slow, exhausting machinery of documentation, testimony, and patient legal process ultimately worked exactly the way it was always supposed to, even if it took 2 full years. Rosa's replacement at the zoning office reached out last month, wanting to formally include Cole Ranch's case in a statewide training program for new inspectors. A small but meaningful legacy neither Hector nor I ever expected when we first hesitantly connected over one late-night phone call about matching stolen acreage. I told her yes without hesitation. If sharing exactly how this fraud unfolded, step by patient step, helps even one future family recognize the same warning signs faster than Hector or I originally did, then every exhausting hour of depositions and document review will have mattered for something larger than just my own land. Cole Ranch's cattle herd grazes calmly tonight near the creek, exactly where a stranger's illegal pavilion once stood glowing with string lights during a defiant grand opening built entirely on stolen ground. Now there's only grass, 2 young oak trees, and quiet, working land doing exactly what it was always meant to do. I still keep my grandfather's branding iron mounted above the rebuilt barn door, a small, deliberate piece of continuity connecting 3 generations of Cole family hands, who've worked this exact same 1,500 acres through very different kinds of hardship, each one ultimately choosing to fight rather than quietly, easily let it go. Carol calls less often now, not from distance, just from comfort, the easy kind of quiet that only comes once a genuine crisis has completely passed and ordinary family life has settled back into its normal, unremarkable rhythm of cattle prices, weather reports, and simple questions about how the herd is doing. Hector and I still meet for coffee most months, comparing notes on irrigation repairs and cattle prices. 2 men whose families never would have connected at all if one confident, manipulative woman hadn't decided both our inherited properties were quietly, patiently hers to forge away over several careful, calculated years. I think that connection, more than any courtroom verdict or demolished pavilion, represents the real, lasting undoing of everything Debbie ever tried to build here. 2 separate victims, isolated deliberately for years, finally finding each other and discovering exactly how much stronger patient, documented truth becomes once it's no longer standing entirely alone. 1,500 acres of Texas grassland stand fully restored tonight under a wide autumn sky. Cattle settling calmly near the tree line. A rebuilt barn holding 3 generations of family history above its door. And not one single trace remaining of everything one woman illegally, confidently tried to steal and build here instead. I walked the entire fence line at sunrise this morning. The same slow, deliberate ritual my grandfather kept for decades before me. Checking posts, checking wire, checking cattle. Exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that fraud can interrupt for a while but can never actually, permanently replace or erase. Marcus told me recently that Debbie's case remains, years later, one of the clearest examples of institutional capture he's encountered in his entire career. A warning about exactly how far patient, confident manipulation can travel through a small county's own trusted offices before somebody finally, thoroughly documents and exposes the whole pattern completely. I think about that phrase often now, institutional capture, because it captures something important about this entire ordeal that a simple story about one greedy woman doesn't fully explain. She didn't just lie. Deliberately captured the exact systems meant to catch lies like hers. One quiet relationship at a time. Breaking that capture took 2 years. 2 families. 1 recorded meeting. 1 honest zoning inspector. 1 cooperating clerk. And 1 jury finally willing to see past a confident, well-liked community leader's carefully cultivated public image toward the documented, undeniable truth sitting patiently underneath it the entire time. Cole Ranch stands quiet and whole tonight, Exactly the way my grandfather built it. Exactly the way it always should have remained. Cattle grazing calmly under a wide Texas sky that has watched this particular 1,500 acres survive drought, hardship, and now, finally, one woman's entire, elaborate fraudulent empire completely dismantled. I still keep that pattern folder close at hand, not out of fear anymore, just out of hard-earned respect for exactly what patient documentation ultimately accomplished here, restoring not just my own inheritance, but Hector's father's land, and an entire community's basic trust in its own local governance process. My grandfather's old hay barn stands rebuilt exactly where it always was, salvaged lumber beside new boards, his branding iron mounted proudly above the door. Quiet, permanent monument to everything this land survived, and to everyone who ultimately refused to let one confident woman's forged signature be the final word on any of it. Debbie Ashcroft remains, as far as anyone in Meadow Creek knows, still serving out her sentence far from here, stripped completely of the land, the title, the marriage, and the carefully built community reputation she once used so skillfully to convince an entire county that fraud could simply wear a friendly, familiar face. Couldn't. Not permanently. Not once patient people finally fully connected the dots she'd worked so hard to keep separate. Coal Ranch stands restored tonight. Cattle grazing under a wide Texas sky. 1,500 acres fully, legally, completely mine again. Exactly the way my grandfather always intended it to stay. 1,500 acres. Reclaimed. One fraudulent HOA. Dissolved and rebuilt honest. One confident, manipulative Karen. Completely, publicly, permanently exposed and stripped of everything she illegally tried to build on land that was never, not for one single day, actually hers to take. The END.